Take a sip of your tea. Feel that warmth spreading through your chest. Taste that comfort, that familiar ritual that millions of people around the world share with you at this very moment. Now imagine this. That innocent cup in your hands once destroyed an empire, started to massive wars, and gave birth to America's independence. One simple leaf changed the course of human history, more than gold, more than ayu, more than any treasure you can think of. Over a cup of tea, nations fell, armies marched. Revolutions began, and the most powerful empire on earth learned a lesson it would never forget. This is not just about a drink. This is about human obsession, the price of addiction, and how something as simple as dried leaves can reveal the deepest truths about power, greed, and freedom. Today, more than 4 billion cups of tea are consumed every day, in London offices, in Tokyo temples, in Moroccan markets, in New York apartments. But behind each cup lies a story of ancient wisdom, imperial madness, and the moment when ordinary people said enough and changed the world forever. So settle in, take another sip, and let me take you on a journey through time. A journey that begins in the misty mountains of ancient China and ends in a lesson that still shapes our world today. The story begins over 4,000 years ago in the mountains of southern China, where legend and history danced together in the morning mist. Emperor Shennong sat beneath a wild tea tree, boiling water over an open fire. The year was 2737 BCE, and the emperor was known for his careful attention to health and safety. He believed that boiled water was safer to drink than water from streams and rivers, a wisdom that would save countless lives throughout history. As he waited for the water to bubble, watching steam rise into the cool mountain air, a gentle breeze stirred the branches above him. A few leaves drifted down into his pot. The clear water began to change color, transforming from transparent to golden, then amber, then a rich, dark brown. The emperor watched this transformation with fascination. The aroma that rose from the pot was unlike anything he had ever experienced, earthy, complex, almost mystical. The emperor was curious, as all great discoveries require curiosity. He lifted the vessel to his lips and tasted this new creation. It was bitter at first, then sweet, then something else entirely, something that seemed to awaken every sense in his body. The drink brought clarity to his mind and energy to his spirit. He felt more awake, more alive than he had in years. His thoughts became sharper, his vision clearer, his body lighter. Cha, he called it, meaning to check or to investigate. This simple word would travel across continents and become tea in English, th in French, ter in Spanish, and 100 other variations in languages around the world. But Emperor Shennong had done more than discover a new beverage. He had unlocked something that would shape human civilization for millennia. That accidental moment under a tea tree had created humanity's second most important liquid, after water itself. In those early days, tea was medicine, not pleasure. Chinese doctors classified tea according to its healing properties: green tea for the stomach, oolong for digestion, aged tea for the spirit. They prescribed specific teas for specific ailments, understanding that these leaves contained powerful compounds that could heal the body and calm the mind. Ancient Chinese medical texts described tea as a cure for everything from headaches to heartbreak, from fatigue to fear. Buddhist monks discovered that tea helped them stay awake during long hours of meditation and prayer. They planted tea gardens around their temples in the mountains, carefully tending to the plants like sacred objects. The monks developed the first rituals around brewing and drinking, understanding that the preparation of tea was as important as the drinking itself. They created elaborate ceremonies where every gesture had meaning, every step had purpose. Water had to be heated to the perfect temperature, leaves had to be measured with precision, timing had to be exact. The art of tea became a spiritual practice, a way to connect with nature and with the divine. Tea masters spent decades learning their craft, studying not just how to grow and prepare tea, but how to create moments of peace and contemplation. In their hands, tea became a bridge between the physical and spiritual worlds, a daily reminder that the simplest acts could contain the deepest meanings. For over 1,000 years, tea remained China's most closely guarded secret. The Chinese government treated tea-making knowledge like state-classified information. Foreign visitors were forbidden from entering tea-growing regions. The process of growing, harvesting, and preparing tea was passed down through families in whispered instructions and carefully guarded techniques. The Chinese understood intuitively that these simple leaves were more valuable than silk, more precious than jade, more powerful than any weapon in their arsenal. Tea became woven into the fabric of Chinese society at every level. In the emperor's palace, Tea ceremonies marked important occasions and diplomatic meetings. In common homes, families gathered around tea to share stories and settle disputes. In markets, business deals were sealed over cups of tea, with the quality of the tea reflecting the seriousness of the negotiation. Workers in fields and factories depended on tea to give them energy for long days of labor. Scholars and poets credited tea with inspiring their greatest works. But here's what the Chinese did unfully comprehend. At the time, they had created something so universally appealing, so fundamentally addictive, that when the rest of the world finally discovered it, nations would literally go to war to possess it. The secret was too good to stay hidden forever. And when it finally escaped China's borders, it would trigger a chain of events that would reshape the global balance of power. By the 17th century, tea had begun its momentous journey beyond China's closely guarded borders. Dutch traders, always searching for new profitable goods to bring back to Europe, were the first Westerners to successfully establish tea trade with China. They loaded their ships with these mysterious dried leaves and sailed back to Amsterdam, where tea was sold for enormous prices to wealthy merchants and aristocrats. A single pound of tea cost more than a working man's monthly wages, making it one of the most expensive commodities in Europe. Then something extraordinary happened that would change the course of world history. Tea reached Britain, and the British didn't just like it, they became completely, utterly, hopelessly obsessed with it. What started as an exotic curiosity for the wealthy quickly transformed into a national addiction that would consume Britain for centuries. Catherine of Braganza, the Portuguese princess who married King Charles II in 1662, is often credited with introducing tea to British high society. She brought her tea-drinking habits from Portugal, where trade with China had been established earlier than in other European countries. When the Queen requested tea instead of ale for breakfast, the entire royal court took notice. Suddenly, tea became fashionable, sophisticated, the mark of refined taste and social status. At first, tea was indeed a luxury reserved for the rich and powerful. A cup of tea cost more than a family's weekly food budget. Tea services made of fine porcelain became status symbols, displayed in the homes of wealthy merchants and noble families. The ritual of afternoon tea developed among aristocratic women who had the leisure time and financial means to create elaborate social gatherings around tea consumption. But as more Dutch and later British ships arrived from China, bringing larger quantities of tea, the price gradually began to drop. By the 1700s, something remarkable was happening. Tea was becoming democratized. Working families could afford to buy small amounts of tea, which they would brew multiple times to stretch their precious supply. Middle-class households made tea a centerpiece of their daily routine. Even children were given weak tea mixed with milk and sugar. The transformation was stunning in its completeness. The British weren't just drinking tea occasionally, they were structuring their entire lives around it. They drank tea for breakfast, replacing beer and ale that had been traditional morning beverages for centuries. They took tea breaks in the afternoon, stopped in work to brew fresh pots and share conversation with colleagues and neighbors. They served tea to guests as a mark of hospitality and respect. They used tea as medicine for sick children and as comfort for grieving families. British tea culture developed its own elaborate social customs and rules. The proper temperature for brewing different types of tea, the correct way to hold a teacup, the appropriate foods to serve with tea, the right time of day for different tea varieties. These customs became so ingrained in British society that violating tea etiquette was considered a serious social mistake. But here is where the story takes a dramatic turn that would reshape global politics. Britain had a massive problem. They couldn't grow tea anywhere in their empire. Only China possessed the climate, soil, and centuries of knowledge necessary to produce the high-quality tea that had become absolutely essential to British life. So Britain had to buy enormous quantities of tea from China, and Chinese merchants demanded payment in silver coins nothing else would do. The financial drain was staggering. Tons and tons of British silver were flowing out of the country and into Chinese treasuries every year. The British Empire, the most powerful military and economic force on earth, was essentially going broke buying tea from China. British economists calculated that the silver spent on tea could have funded entire armies or built dozens of warships. The British government tried everything they could think of to solve this crisis. They sent diplomatic missions to Beijing, begging the Chinese emperor to accept other forms of payment. They offered fine British wool, which the Chinese rejected as inferior to their own textiles. They tried to sell British manufactured goods, but Chinese officials told them politely but firmly, "We have everything we need. We have no use for your foreign products." The message was clear: silver or nothing. Take it or leave it. This is where the story takes its darkest turn, revealing how far empires will go to protect their addictions. Desperate to find something that Chinese people would buy, British merchants discovered that there was one product the Chinese wanted: opium. This dangerous, highly addictive drug was grown in British-controlled India and could be shipped to Chinese ports, where demand was growing rapidly among Chinese users. The British had found their solution, but it was a devil's bargain. Soon, millions of Chinese people were addicted to opium, their lives and families destroyed by the drug. But British silver was flowing back into British banks, and British tea imports could continue uninterrupted. The British had solved their tea problem by creating a much larger moral and social catastrophe. The Chinese government watched in horror as opium addiction spread through their population like a plague. Entire cities had districts filled with opium dens where people lay unconscious for days, neglecting their families, their work, and their health. Chinese officials saw clearly that opium was destroying the social fabric of their civilization, weakening their people and undermining their nation's strength. In 1839, Chinese officials decided they had tolerated enough. Led by Commissioner Lindsay, Chinese authorities confiscated and destroyed over 20,000 chests of British opium in the port of Canton, millions of dollars worth of drugs thrown into the harbor and burned on the beaches. Commissioner Lin wrote a letter to Queen Victoria, asking her directly, "Where is your conscience? Where is your humanity?" He demanded that Britain stop poisoning Chinese people with opium. The British response was swift, brutal, and revealing of how much tea meant to their empire. They sent warships to China and declared war not over territory, not over honor, but over the right to continue selling drugs to Chinese people so that Britain could keep buying tea. This was the first Opium War, and it represented one of the most shameful chapters in the history of international relations. When the war ended in 1842, China was forced to sign the Treaty of Nanjing under threat of continued British bombardment. Hong Kong became a British colony. 5 Chinese ports were opened to British merchants. China was forced to pay Britain for the destroyed opium, and most importantly, for British tea drinkers. Opium trading continued, ensuring that British silver would keep flowing back from China to pay for tea imports. But the tea obsession that had started this conflict was just beginning to reshape the world in even more dramatic ways. Across the Atlantic Ocean, British colonists in America had also fallen completely under tea spell. From the bustling ports of Boston to the plantation houses of Charleston, Americans were consuming enormous quantities of tea, 3 times a day, in every home, regardless of social class or economic status. Tea had become as fundamentally American as it was British, a shared cultural bond between mother country and colonies. American tea culture had developed its own characteristics, blending British traditions with colonial practicality. American housewives learned to stretch expensive tea by reusing leaves multiple times and mixing tea with local herbs to extend supplies. American merchants made fortunes importing tea from China and distributing it throughout the colonies. American social gatherings centered around tea service, with elaborate tea sets becoming prized family possessions passed down through generations, until one day, tea transformed from a symbol of shared culture into the symbol of everything Americans had come to hate about British rule. The transformation began with British attempts to solve their ongoing financial problems through increased taxation of the American colonies. In 1773, the British government passed the Tea Act, a law that seemed reasonable to British politicians but felt like a betrayal to American merchants and consumers. The law gave the British East India Company a complete monopoly on tea sales in America, cutting out American merchants who had been building tea businesses for decades. Worse still, the law forced Americans to pay taxes on tea without giving them any representation in the British Parliament that was imposing these taxes. No taxation without representation became the rallying cry that echoed through American cities and towns. But the slogan represented something deeper than a dispute over tax policy. It reflected growing American resentment over being treated as second-class citizens within their own empire, being used simply as a source of revenue for British government expenses. The confrontation came to a head on the cold evening of December 16, 1773, in Boston Harbor. A group of colonists, led by Samuel Adams and disguised as Mohawk Indians to hide their identities, boarded 3 British ships loaded with East India Company tea. Working quietly but efficiently through the night, they dumped 342 chests of tea into the harbor waters. The tea was worth more than $1 million, and today as an enormous financial blow to the British East India Company. But the Boston Tea Party was more than economic sabotage. It was a carefully planned political statement. The colonists swept the ship's decks clean after dumping the tea, replaced a broken padlock, and even swept up spilled tea to show that they were protesting specific policies. not engaging in random destruction. They were rebels, but they were principled rebels who wanted to send a clear message about British overreach. The British government's reaction was swift and harsh, revealing how seriously they took any threat to their tea-based economic system. They passed the Coercive Acts, known in America as the Intolerable Acts, punishing all of Boston for the actions of the tea. Boston Harbor was closed until the destroyed tea was paid for. Massachusetts lost its right to sell. British officials accused of crimes could be tried in England rather than in American courts. Colonists were forced to house British soldiers in their homes. But the British had made a fatal strategic error. By punishing all colonists for the actions of a few, they had transformed a local Boston protest into a continental crisis. Colonists who had been quietly grumbling about British policies were now ready to risk everything in open rebellion. The tea that had brought Britain such wealth and global power had become the spark that would cost them their most valuable colonies and change the balance of world power forever. Within 2 years, the American Revolution had begun, and British forces were fighting desperately to hold on to colonies that generated enormous wealth for the empire. The irony was perfect and devastating. The British had fought wars against China to keep their tea supply flowing. Now tea was causing them to lose America, the source of much of the wealth they needed to buy that tea in the first place. The empire that tea had built was being destroyed by tea itself in a circular tragedy that revealed the dangers of building national policy around addictive consumption. As the 19th century progressed, tea transformed from a luxury item fought over by empires into a global industry that connected continents and cultures. The British, determined never again to depend entirely on China for their tea supply, launched one of the most ambitious agricultural projects in history, stealing tea plants from China and establishing plantations throughout their empire. This was not simple. Commerce, it was agricultural espionage on a massive scale. British botanists and adventurers risked their lives sneaking into China's tea-growing regions, carefully studying cultivation techniques and smuggling tea plants and seeds out of the country. Robert Forchan, a Scottish botanist, spent years in China disguised as a Chinese merchant, learning tea production secrets and collecting plant specimens. His work, and that of other plant hunters, would break China's millennial monopoly on tea production. The British planted stolen Chinese tea varieties in the mountains of India, particularly in Assam, in Darjeeling regions that proved to have ideal climate conditions for tea cultivation. They established plantations in Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, where Heltidu growing conditions produced teas with unique flavors and characteristics. They experimented with tea growing in Kenya, Malawi, and other African colonies. Each region developed its own tea varieties, creating a global industry that employed millions of people and generated enormous wealth for the British Empire. The results exceeded British expectations. Indian Assam tea proved to be strong and malty, perfect for the British preference for tea with milk and sugar. Darjeeling tea was delicate and aromatic, prized by tea connoisseurs for its complex flavor profiles. Ceylon tea was bright and citrusy, ideal for afternoon consumption. Kenyan tea was bold and hearty, perfect for the working-class British market. By the 1870s, British colonies were producing enough tea to supply their domestic market, and Britain was no longer dependent on China for this essential commodity. The empire had learned its lesson about putting all its tea leaves in one basket, creating a diversified supply chain that protected against political disruptions and trade disputes. But the real transformation came with the Industrial Revolution, which applied mass production techniques to tea processing and distribution. Steam-powered ships cut the journey time between tea gardens and tea tables from months to weeks, ensuring that fresher tea reached consumers. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 shortened the route between Asia and Europe even further, making tea imports faster and cheaper. Factories developed machines that could process tea leaves faster and more consistently than human hands. Rolling machines bruised tea leaves to release their flavors. Drying machines controlled moisture content precisely. Sorting machines separated tea leaves by size and quality. The age of mass-produced, standardized tea had arrived, making consistent quality tea available to working-class families throughout the British Empire and beyond. In Britain, tea had become so central to daily life that it was reshaping work schedules and social customs. Employers began providing official tea breaks for their workers, recognizing that productivity improved when people had regular opportunities to rest and refresh themselves with tea. The afternoon tea ritual, popularized by Anna, the Duchess of Bedford, became a social institution that defined British gentility and hospitality. Tea rooms opened in every British town and city, creating new opportunities for women to socialize outside their homes and new career opportunities for women as tea room operators and servers. Tea advertising filled newspapers and magazines, with companies competing to convince consumers that their particular brand offered superior quality or health benefits. The cup that cheers but does not inebriate became tea's advertising motto, positioning it as a healthy, socially acceptable alternative to alcohol. The British weren't content to keep their tea obsession within their own borders. Wherever the British Empire expanded, tea culture followed, adapting to local tastes and traditions. In India, chai became a street food, sold by vendors who mix strong black tea with milk, sugar, and aromatic spices like cardamom, cinnamon, and ginger. In Kongi, tea houses became important gathering places where business deals were negotiated and community news was shared. In Australia and New Zealand, smoko tea time became as important as any meal, a cultural institution that unified workers across different industries and social classes. Meanwhile, an accidental invention in America was about to revolutionize tea consumption worldwide. In the early 1900s, Thomas Sullivan, a New York tea merchant, sent samples of his tea to potential customers in small silk pouches, intending for them to remove the tea and brew it in the traditional way. Instead, customers discovered they could brew excellent tea by simply dropping the entire pouch into hot water. The tea bag was born from this happy accident. The tea bag democratized tea drinking by making it accessible to busy people who didn't have time for elaborate brewing rituals. Office workers could make tea at their desks. Travelers could brew tea in hotel rooms. Home cooks could prepare tea quickly without measuring loose leaves or cleaning Within decades, tea bags accounted for the majority of tea consumption in America and was spreading rapidly to other countries. The 20th century brought both triumph and crisis to the global tea world, testing the resilience of this industry that had become essential to billions of people. During both world wars, tea became a symbol of civilian resilience and national determination. The British government rationed tea strictly but never stopped imports entirely, recognizing that tea was essential to national morale and productivity. A nice cup of tea became the standard British response to every crisis, from air raids during the London Blitz to family emergencies and personal tragedies. British soldiers received tea rations as part of their military supplies, and tea preparation became a comforting ritual that connected troops to home and normalcy even in the midst of combat. After World War II, tea consumption exploded globally as new processing techniques created different types of tea for different tastes and preferences. Green tea, which had been consumed primarily in East Asia, found new markets in health-conscious Western countries. White tea, made from young tea buds, became a luxury product prized for its delicate flavor and supposed health benefits. Oolong tea, partially fermented, appealed to consumers looking for something between green and black tea. The ancient Chinese understanding of tea as medicine was rediscovered and validated by modern scientific research. Scientists found that tea contained antioxidants, particularly compounds called polyphenols, that could help prevent cancer, heart disease, and other chronic conditions. Studies suggested that regular tea consumption could improve brain function, boost immune system performance, and even extend lifespan. Tea became part of the global wellness movement, with specialty tea shops offering dozens of varieties promising different health benefits. Herbal teas, which technically aren't tea since they don't contain leaves from the tea plant, became popular alternatives for people seeking caffeine-free options. The global tea market expanded to include everything from traditional Chinese green teas to innovative blends, combining tea with fruits, spices, and exotic ingredients. Today, tea is the second most consumed beverage in the world, surpassed only by water itself. More than 40 countries grow tea commercially, employing millions of people in agriculture, processing, distribution, and retail. The global tea trade generates billions of dollars annually and connects tea gardens in remote mountain regions to consumers in major cities around the world. But perhaps most importantly, tea has taught us something profound about human nature, globalization, and the unexpected connections that bind us all together across cultures, continents, and centuries. Here is the lesson that tea teaches us. The things that seem smallest and most ordinary often turn out to be the most powerful forces in human history. A few leaves accidentally falling into hot water changed the course of empires, sparked revolutions, and connected distant civilizations in ways that still shape our world today. A simple tax on tea created the United States of America. A British addiction to tea led to wars that affected millions of people and redrew maps of entire continents. Tea shows us how human obsessions can drive both incredible creativity and terrible destruction. The British love of tea led to beautiful cultural traditions, magnificent literature, and innovations in agriculture and manufacturing. But it also led to destructive wars, colonial exploitation, and the deliberate poisoning of entire populations through opium trafficking. Tea brought prosperity to some regions while creating dependency and suffering in others. It connected distant lands and cultures, but also created new forms of economic control and political domination. Tea reveals the complexity of globalization centuries before we had a word for that process. Every cup of tea consumed in 18th century London connected British consumers to Chinese farmers, Indian laborers, ship crews crossing dangerous oceans, merchants in distant ports, and countless other people whose lives were shaped by this global trade network. Tea created some of the world's first truly international businesses and some of its first global supply chains. Most importantly, tea reminds us that in our interconnected world, nothing exists in isolation. The cup of tea you drink today connects you to farmers in Kenya who woke before dawn, to pick tea leaves, factory workers in Sri Lanka who processed and packaged those leaves, ship crews who transported tea across oceans, truck drivers who delivered it to warehouses, and shop workers who put it on shelves where you could buy it. Every sip carries within it the weight of human history and the promise of human connection. It links you to the Chinese emperor who first tasted tea, 4,000 years ago, to the British families who structured their lives around tea rituals, to the American colonists who dumped tea into Boston Harbor to protest tyranny, and to billions of people around the world who will share this simple pleasure with you today. So the next time you hold a warm cup of tea, pause for a moment and remember this extraordinary story. Remember the emperor who first discovered tea's magic under a tree in ancient China. Remember the wars fought over tea and the peace made over tea. Remember the revolutions sparked by tea and the traditions built around tea. Remember that in your hands you hold not just a beverage but a piece of human history, a symbol of our shared humanity and a reminder that the most ordinary moments in our lives are connected to the most extraordinary stories of our collective past. And perhaps that STS's greatest lesson of all, that the simplest axe brewing leaves in hot water, sharing a warm cup with a friend, taking a moment to pause and reflect, can contain within them all the complexity, beauty, and mystery of human civilization itself.